This is the Germans from Russia Experience, Episode 6, Our Grandmother's Journey, with special guest Erin Deis. Welcome to the Germans from Russia Experience. I am your host, Elisa Rodriguez, and I am here to inspire you and others to learn anything and everything about your own family heritage by providing information, experiences, and stories about a special group of people, the Germans from Russia. Hello everyone, I am your host Elisa, and today I'm so excited to introduce you to a new, however, dear friend of mine, Erin Deis. I have only known Erin for a few years, however, we have some connections that go way back. It may appear from the title that we are related, sisters or cousins, but we are not related, and together we will share with you the incredibly interesting connections that we have discovered between our grandmothers. Hi, Erin.
Hi, good morning. Hello, hello.
How are you?
Good. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we are here sitting at the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia building in the Research Library, which has become a great place to record. And we are here the day after Thanksgiving. So are you feeling full still?
Yeah, a little bit. Got to loosen up the pants a little there.
Yeah. So we're hoping I'm going to have a day of very light eating today, trying to get over all that. Speaking of Thanksgiving, this year I asked my mother to make a Jell-O salad because it was so traditional growing up. And for years I haven't wanted it at all. Like I could care less about it. There's so many other things to eat. But this year I was just feeling very nostalgic and I asked my mother to make that. And so she did. And it was delicious.
Yeah. What flavor?
It
Jell-O?
was the raspberry or strawberry. I don't know. It was pink. It was pink.
Yeah. No, good stuff.
With the
good
nuts
stuff.
and the whip and the
Where it could literally be a dessert, but we call it salad. Love it.
Yeah. Awesome.
Love it.
All
Yeah.
right. So we are here again to discuss our grandmother's connections. And we have a question. When did we first learn or realize that we were descendants of Germans from Russia? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think growing up in Fresno, and I don't know if you remember this, but there was something called Passport Fresno, and it would take place on the Fulton Mall. And I remember, I think maybe we'd get extra credit at my elementary school. Shout out to Daly Elementary in Manchester Gate. But we would get extra credit for going to Passport Fresno. And I think it was maybe in the Fresno Bee, there was this passport. And you'd go and you'd walk along and you'd see different groups. And I remember a friend of mine at the time, she was there with the Italian group. And I remember there was the Armenian group. And then I remember coming to the German group. And so it was the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia.
Right.
But in my mind, the Russia part didn't click. And it was
Right.
just we were German.
Same.
We were German. And so in my mind, I think a lot of that is all I ever really thought about is that, oh, yeah, we're German. My grandma used to speak German, my grandpa, right? So it wasn't necessarily a part of what I was thinking about in terms of my heritage, I think, until I got much older and really realized, oh, we actually were Germans that lived in another place, right? Our families. And so I would say probably around high school is when that came about for me. And I was lucky enough to be part of a Sister Cities exchange when I was in high school. Shout out to Fresno High. When I was at Fresno High, my summer after my freshman year, we had an exchange with, at the time, was the Soviet Union.
Oh, wow.
And our Fresno sister city was a place now called Taraz, but at the time was called Jambol. And so I went and I lived with a host family in Jambol. And I remember speaking to my family that I stayed with was rather well off. The father was part of the KGB.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so we had a driver who would drive me and my host sister everywhere. And so my driver I've like through the years now figured out was a Volga German. And like we were talking about how like, oh, we could be cousins, right? Like we joked or whatever. He
Yeah.
was really young.
Yeah.
And then I just remember when we would go, because they would show us off throughout all the different places that we would visit that summer. And I remember almost everywhere we went, folks said, "Oh, do you speak German?" And at the time, it didn't just click for me, but clearly all these people that we were going to meet in Jambul, which was is in Kazakhstan, they were Germans from Russia. They were Volga Germans.
Yeah.
They had been displaced and had remained in Kazakhstan. And so, but I think, you know, as I got older and started doing more research, I got into more of what that meant. But again, always it just felt like, oh, we're just German. We're just German. So, what about you?
Well, me for growing up, I did hear a little bit of German from my grandparents, not directly to me, but they would say things once in a while. I did take German in high school because, you know, I knew that I was German, and I would try to, you know, talk to my grandmother, but I didn't get very far. I'm not a language learner, not a strong language learner. But I did that. And I remember saying to grandma a couple times that, you know, let's take a trip to Germany. And she just wasn't interested at all. Of course, I knew that she was born in Russia. And again, when I was young, I didn't realize what that really meant. I have to say until I started having my own family, and by then my grandmother had passed, so I couldn't ask her things directly. But I always clung on to two things that I had about my family history. One was the story that my grandmother wrote when my older cousin was in high school for his history class. She wrote an account of her coming to America's story, and it was only like 2.5 binder pages handwritten, so it wasn't a lot, but every time I read it over the years, I find more things in there, things that have helped me research different areas. And then the other thing that I've clung on to is about 30 years ago, one of my grandfather's cousins, again, both of my grandparents had already passed away, but my grandmother's cousin invited us over and gave me a stack of those family history charts, the pedigree charts. There's another name for them. Little family trees for each individual family. Sure. And she gave those to me for my grandfather's family, and I still have them. I've entered all that information into my ancestry, but I still have them, and that was really what just kept me you know, thinking about it all these years until maybe 10 or so years ago. I didn't really do much about it. I just had the stuff. Sure. And then photos. I always love photos, all the old photos. Yeah. So those were some of the things that got me interested in my family history.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And then, you mentioned, I didn't know that you had gone to Kazakhstan. That's pretty amazing. And then you've also been to the Volga.
I have. Yes, yeah. My dad and I went a little over 7 years ago, so the summer of 2017, and we got to visit numerous villages on the Volga that are near Saratov, which is the nearest like really big city, and then we went all the way down to Volgograd, and it was I you know, it's unbelievable to me that I was able to be there. I think I felt really emotional for sure, especially in the village that my grandmother was born and your grandmother was born and raised in, to be there. You know, there aren't really any of the Germans that are left there.
Right.
It's Russians that live there now. But the buildings are all the same. Like, I'm sure it looks very much like it would have looked like when they were there. And so just to be there and just to see the enormity of the Volga, it's just so lovely and so beautiful. And it was really a very amazing, just life-changing experience, and felt really great to be able to kind of capture some of the soil. I don't know if that's legal or not. But
it's not a national park in the United States.
Captured some soil to be able to bring back and sprinkle on the graves of my grandparents.
Oh, that's neat.
You know, my grandfather was a baby when he left, so he had no real memories. So he had talked about often wanting to go back and to see it, because he had only heard it through stories through his uncles and his parents. But my grandma, who had a memory much like yours, was like, yeah, no, you're going on your own. I'm not doing that. I have no desire to go back.
Neither of my grandparents ever had any kind of desire to go. to go, but I hope that someday I can. I mean, that is, people talk about their bucket lists, and I really don't have a lot on it, but
Yeah.
that would be one of them, is to walk where, our people walked,
Yeah.
and just to feel that, because I can imagine that it would be quite strong emotions there. Yeah. Okay, so we met about 3 years ago through here, through the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia, and I'm not even sure where the first whim of connection came between us, that our grandmothers might know each other.
Yeah.
I don't remember how we decided that. How did we even come to that?
I don't actually remember.
Maybe it was you who discovered it, because you had that photo of the wedding party. I think because you sent that to me.
Yeah.
There was a photo of my grandmother as a
Yes.
bride and her bridesmaids.
It was in the Fresno.
It was in the
Republican.
Fresno
probably.
Republican, 1934.
Yeah.
And the names were on there. So
Yes.
you saw my grandmother's name on
Yeah.
there,
Yeah,
Catherine
yeah,
Lung.
yeah.
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 And that's how you made the connection. And I did not know that your grandmother was also in the picture.
It's a bridesmaid.
Because her name at the
Lovely.
time was her maiden name.
Correct. Yeah. Kukas.
Yes, and so it didn't connect with me. And then once we decided that our grandmothers knew each other as 20-year-olds,
Yes.
that I asked my parents, "Do you remember the name Mary Deis?" Mary Deis, and they said they couldn't remember grandma ever knowing a Mary Deis. But we quickly discovered that our grandmothers went to different churches.
Yes.
So that might have been the reason
Sure.
they weren't super close. But then you did a lot of research about your grandmother's journey,
Yeah.
and we discovered that they were both living in Kukas at the
Yeah.
time that they fled.
Yeah.
And say
Those
more
little-
about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So you had the story that you mentioned before,
Right.
That your grandmother
and I shared it
had-
with you.
Yeah.
That's what it was. I
Yeah,
shared it with
definitely. You
you.
shared it with me, and then I had come down to Fresno to present around my grandma's story, and when we kind of compared
That's
and
right.
looked,
Yes.
and then we also looked. There's a book about Kukas, and there are
Okay.
multiple stories that are in there. I want to say there's like 3 different women had written stories about their experience, and they were part of the same travel party that you and I figured
Okay.
out.
Yeah.
Our grandmothers were a part of it. 8-ish years old, right?
Yes, in my grandmother's story, she describes that there were 50 people in their party when they left that October. And we don't have a list of those names.
We do.
Do you?
We do.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
But we are pretty sure that our families were both in that same
Yes.
group. They didn't stay together all the way to Fresno, but they
Correct.
ended up in Fresno.
Yes.
Many of them did.
Yeah, and most likely had some very similar experiences along the way. I would say that, we know that they both ended up in what I used to think was the regular old Frankfurt or Frankfurt, right, which we think of as the big city in Germany. But in fact, there's another Frankfurt that's on the Oder River.
Okay, all right.
And I was able to do some research later. There's a website that's about and we can give that obviously on
Sure,
YouTube
yeah.
and show
Show
that
notes
to
will
folks.
all be on there.
We'll show those to folks. But there's a website that exists and talks about the refugee camp that was there. This homecoming refugee camp is what it was called in German, and both of our grandmas ended up there at different times. They both arrived at different times. They both left at different times. But my grandmother spent a good year of her life there.
Yeah,
had
yeah.
a baby brother who was born before they left to come to Fresno. So just really fascinating. And I know along the way, I mean, you can talk a little bit about it, but just some of the losses that your own family and some fears that I know your grandma went through with her own mother and that experience.
Yeah, along the way in Poland, as they were fleeing, and they were running for their lives. My grandmother's mother, my great grandmother, became ill with what my grandmother wrote, brain fever. And so I did some research on that, and that's typhoid. She got typhoid fever. And of course, this is before antibiotics.
Sure.
And before, they probably thought she was going to die. And they were separated from her for 3 months. They moved on ahead and went to Frankfurt while her mother stayed behind. mind, I'm sure there was no communication.
Sure.
They had no
No.
idea if she was going to join them, if she was even going to survive, be able to find them. I mean, my grandmother was only 6, 7 years old at the time, so she was terrified. But her mother did get well, and she joined them. And you were able to share with me, Erin, you found the website for the refugee camp, and on there it shows her mother arriving alone without other family on a day that was 3 months or 4 months after the rest of the family arrived. And that was amazing. I never thought a record like that would exist.
Yeah, no, it's so amazing. No, and so lucky that they were able to find each other, right? Like it just seems, I mean, today's, folks
Right.
have cell phones and
Yes.
and the ability to, you could drop a pin maybe, but like just then for them to be able to
Yeah,
find each
yeah.
other is so amazing and so
Yeah,
lovely. And
yeah,
so my grandmother along the way, she had two half brothers, Peter and Johnny. They were little ones, toddlers. And they had left as part of that travel party that you mentioned. And both of them died along the way. And so my grandma lost those two younger brothers along the way. And, those were things that I had never heard about growing up. And so,
Sure.
talking about like, how did I get interested in this? If you don't mind, I can talk a little bit. My grandmother, about a year before she died, I want to say it was like late 90s. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. And my parents lived in Fresno, so I'd be coming to see them. And then I'd drive back to LA and I'd stop by and see her in Easton. And she would tell me just random little tidbits. And there were no cell phones at the time. So I'd get back to LA and I'd call my dad and be like, Dad, Grandma told me this. Like, do you know that? And he's like, Erin, I don't know what she's talking about. And he was like, she's telling you stuff. And this happened multiple times. And so for me, I felt like, okay, she's trying to tell me these things and I want to honor that and I want to know more. And so one day, I took a day off work. I was working in LA at the time and I called her up and I said, Grandma, I'm going to come tomorrow and just want to hang out with you for the day and talk. And so I left LA probably 4 o'clock in the morning, maybe got here to her house and she made us breakfast. And I asked her like one question. And quite honestly, she talked for the entire day. She made us breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and we just sat in her kitchen. And she told me all these stories. It wasn't in a like linear fashion. It was
Sure.
kind of a little bit all over the place, but I was capturing it as quickly as I could, writing it down as fast as I could. And so much of what I know and what I've been able to research would not have been possible without all of those things that she told me on that day. So I feel so lucky that I got to hear that from her. And then go back later and try to, fit some things together because her memory, just like your grandmother's memory, right, would have been as a young child. And
Sure.
so the ways in which they might remember things or places might be a little bit different. And also my grandmother, after they had been here not very long, her mother passed away. My great grandmother passed away. And so my grandmother, who was, raising a sick stepsister and a younger brother, her baby sister died, and then had a, not so kind stepfather. I think she just didn't get the same stories that you would if you were living with your mother to help you
Right.
remember.
Yeah.
And so I feel really lucky that what she did remember, she
Right.
did share with
and
me.
then you got as much as you
I
did, and you
did.
wrote it down.
Yeah,
and you,
totally.
You wrote about it. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really great.
Well, let's actually go back because
Sure.
one of the things that we found that we were connected about were our great grandfathers. Our grandmother's fathers were both young men who were conscripted
Yeah.
into the Russian army. There right during World War I.
Yep.
And you and I discovered that they both were wounded and they both died in the Russian army when they were in their early 20s. So our grandmothers were without their fathers when they were very young.
Yep.
And yeah, the story on my side goes, it was written in my grandmother's handwriting that she said that her father died when she was 3 months old.
Okay.
And the discovery that you helped me make, we found his name on that Russian war hero website.
World War I website.
Yes,
Yep,
we
yep.
found his name. We're not 100% sure that it is my person,
right.
but it's the only person with that name, and it fits the timeline that my
Sure.
grandmother knew. It said that he was wounded, and the day that he was wounded was the day after my grandmother was born.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So he wasn't there for her birth. He was in the army.
Yeah.
And then my grandmother's story says that her mother took her to see her father when she was 1 month old, and that he was ill in Moscow in the army. So he had been wounded and probably contracted pneumonia. This was in December, January in Russia when it was very cold. And way back in those days, there was no medications.
Gangrene,
and of course,
or whatever.
Yes, pneumonia. I think she wrote in there pneumonia. Now that could be part of a story, but it makes sense that he could have gotten pneumonia if he's laying around wounded.
Yeah.
And then
so he did get to meet her once then.
he did. He knew
That's
of his
lovely.
daughter. Yeah, he knew of his daughter. So, and then he already had one son. I think my uncle, my grandmother's brother was about 3 years older than her. So, so he probably had memories of his father. Yeah. So both of our grandmothers grew up with a stepfather.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And similarly, so my great grandfather, Jacob Felsing, he was away when she was born. So she was born around Christmas of 1913, and similarly though, before he was injured, before he was hurt, he came back to visit. That's my grandma's story. And so she doesn't remember because obviously she was a baby, but he did come back to visit her and got to meet her, and before he was shipped off again. And I hope folks who have family who may have been part of World War I that are Germans from Russia, that they have a chance to check out this website.
I've tried to access it recently, and you can't access it right now because
it
it is a Russian website, so that might be part of the problem. Maybe in the future.
That might be. But it is. It's definitely like, you know, I feel like it's a labor of love for whoever did this.
Yeah,
because they literally have gone through all of these millions. It's like 6 million, I think, that died. And so like to go through and just catalog all of that and all of the information. And so for me to be able to find out, like, you know, my grandma had heard, oh, your father was shot. And then, you know, they had no medicines for him, and then he died there in a field, essentially, right? Is what she was told. But like, I was able to go back and like find out the literal day, same as you, right? The literal day that it happened, where it happened. Like, it said that he was shell shocked is what happened, that it was on the left bank of the Vistula River, which is in Poland. I mean, it just is so wonderful to be able to have that. I wish our grandmas could have had a little bit of that closure too, but so great that we're able to figure that out.
And then from the research that you've done about that, you understand that there's a couple of burial sites that your grandfather may be interned there.
Yeah, no, definitely. They have like Tomb of the Unknown Soldier kind of thing, like we would have here in the United States. There are 2 of them that are in Poland that are very near there. And so I would assume that's probably where his body was laid to rest. So yeah, someday I would love to be able to. Do
you think
it
was
there.
laid to rest or just dumped in a hole?
I'm choosing to say it in a more
I'm sorry.
kind way, but yeah, I'm sure they were just tossed in there for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, because there were thousands of them. Yeah,
mass grave type of situation. And you're hoping to visit there someday?
I would love to be able to. Yeah, absolutely. To pay respect to him. Like, I know that, you know, we have a photograph. It's actually not a photograph. It's a painting that was made of my grandmother's, like her passport picture when she came to the U.S. And then the one photograph that we have of my great grandfather, and it's him in his military uniform. And so my grandma, at some point, when she had the money to be able to do that, she had a painting made of the 2 of them together, because she never would have had that of the 2 of them together, because he died before she was a year old. So
sure.
That's a special thing that we have hanging in our in my parents' home now.
Yeah. It's possible that I could create something exactly like that, because I have a portrait of my great grandfather, not in a military uniform. He doesn't have a jacket on. He has like a thermal type shirt, but boots. You know, he's sitting in a chair, and they brought that with them from Russia. Even though he had, you know, passed away, that's one thing that my great grandmother brought with her. And when they came here, then she had it blown up into a portrait for the wall, which is what I grew up seeing all the time. And I didn't even know till 6 years ago that there was the small card photo that she carried with her. Of course, I just didn't understand the dynamics of all of that. But of course, she couldn't have brought that large portrait.
Sure.
They didn't even probably have those
Yeah.
things then. So she brought that little
But
card.
after all that they had been through, right? And all the separation and running for their lives, escaping, right? Like all of these things that they would hold on to those. And I think the same about my grandma as a migrant farm worker working, walk up and down the state of California, that she held on to this photograph of her father and how important it was to her. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And she, my great grandmother kept that for her children because it was their
yeah.
father.
Yeah.
And possibly the love of her life. That
Yeah.
was her first person that she had a family with. So yeah. Brick walls. Brick walls. Are there any that we're still wondering about?
I think for me, because I've been able to do so much around my great grandfather, and find out how he died. I feel like I have a good sense, like, and especially because he's a Felsing, and the Felsings, we
Well
can
documented.
yes, yeah, they go, we can trace them back to Germany. And there's a great Kukis website that exists that folks, if they have family in Kukis, can take a look at. I think that is great. I would be curious about my great grandmother. She was a Steinhauer, which for people who live
Around
here in the
here.
Central Valley,
Yeah.
like they would know that name. It's a popular name, and so she was a Steinhauer. But I don't know that much about her family and kind of beyond. She actually wasn't from Kukis. She was from Bongert, which was a couple of villages away, which I also got to visit when I went in 2017. But yeah, I think I'd like to know more about her, but it's so hard. And I think it's so hard anytime you're trying to kind of track down women, right? It's a lot easier to track down the male side because of the last names and what you're able to find. So yeah, I would love to know about Maria Catarina, my great grandma.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know because
Sure.
for years I thought, well, this is all I have because there's nothing else out there. But there's always more out there. Like when you showed me that war website, I was blown away. And then the one about the refugee camp, I could not believe it. I have one of those card photos of my grandmother's family at that refugee camp.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yes, I have the
Yeah.
actual one of the
So great.
originals that has her. Your family is not in the photo with them, but there's 3 or 4 other families in that photo. Of course, there were hundreds of people there,
Yeah.
so that just happened to be who was there that day, I guess. But for brick walls, one that I was trying to break through did concern this great grandfather that we're talking about that was in the war. All my grandmother had written in her story that I knew all these years was just the date that he died. His birth date was not there. And so I wasn't able to trace his family. I didn't know of any of his siblings. I didn't know his parents' names, and I thought I would never know. I reached out to a couple of people here in California that do Marcus family research because the name is Marcus, and one man was trying to help me narrow down which Heinrich Marcus it could be, and he had 5 names within a window that he was not able to trace. He didn't know what happened to these 5 men. He said it's probably one of these 5 guys. So for years I said, well, it's one of these guys, but I don't know which one. So to research 5 families was just too much. So I never went forward with that. But a few months back, I was inherited a Bible from my grandmother's estate. It was a Bible that I've talked about on my podcast before that was gifted to my grandparents. And my grandmother wrote in it. And I was seeing all names I knew. Oh, I know all these people, my cousins, my aunts and uncles, and their birth dates and everything. I knew all these people. And then I turned the page and it says my grandparents. And it said Katharina Bopp and Johannes Marcus, it said. And I was just dumbfounded. I had never heard these names before, never seen them before. So from that, I put that into my ancestry, into my family tree. And I have yet to personally connect with people on that side of the family, but Heinrich Marcus, my great-grandfather, who died in World War I when my grandmother was a baby, he had a sister who came to Fresno
What?
in 1900 with her family. She was a bit older than him. She was 8. He was only 8 when she left.
Oh, wow.
So he
Okay.
probably had no connection to her once she came here.
Yeah.
But she raised a family, and there are hundreds of family members that are related to Heinrich Marcus that came through Fresno. So I've connected with one person over the
Sure.
internet, but
Sure.
I haven't met anybody in person yet, and I'm hoping that that will happen soon,
Oh,
because that would be amazing to meet someone like
yeah,
that.
for sure. Oh my
And then
goodness.
another brick wall. You mentioned the uh, village of Bangart. That
Uh-huh.
is where my grandmother's mother, who I've talked about, my great
Uh-huh.
grandmother, was born.
Uh-huh.
And then she went to Lauv, where she met Heinrich Marcus, and then to Kukis when she got
Uh-huh.
married again.
Uh-huh.
But Anna Gamel was her name. And I have a Gamel family history that a cousin who also came to Fresno put together. But Anna Gamel has no siblings listed. All it says
Oh.
is I have her parents' names, but I don't have any siblings. All it
Hmm.
says is all of them were sent to Siberia.
Oh.
So there's a brick wall
Sure.
because there are documents out there.
Sure.
It's not a full list of
Sure.
names, but I may be able to find some of those people and where they went.
Yeah.
When I put my DNA into not Ancestry, another one that's more global. I uploaded my
Yeah.
DNA into another website. I can't think of what it is,
Uh-huh.
or I would tell
Uh-huh.
you.
Uh-huh.
And I had got connections with cousins all over the world,
Sure.
like in
Sure.
almost
Sure.
every country.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
thinking, well, who are these people? Well, they
Right.
have to be related to those that stayed behind
Mm-hmm.
because people didn't come here and then go back.
Right.
Maybe a few did, but
Yeah. Yeah.
so those are other brick walls that I would like to make connections
Absolutely.
with people. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I got some chills, I think, when you were
Aw.
talking about no, because I think the great grandfather, at least for me, and especially having grown up with that portrait. It's at my parents' house now, but I grew up. It was at my grandma's house always, and so just always was so intrigued by him, and just like, who is this guy? Like, I just felt like he could kind of peer into your soul, and just seemed like I don't know. And I know that for my grandmother, longing for that connection in a way I'm sure your grandmother did as well, although I know she had a great
She did.
stepfather who
She
took
did.
care of her. Yeah. But yeah, I just think, and then even on that, the portrait that hangs, he's got this little dip in his ear, and my grandma always used to check babies for the little dip in their ear, and it was because my uncle Charlie, who's now passed away, he had one in his ear, and my cousin Tim, who looks a lot like Jacob, also had one in his ear, and then I believe a couple of Tim's daughters actually have that little dip in their ear too. So, but that was always what my grandma would always check the babies to see if it was there for that little connection
Yeah.
to her father. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one difference we found was that the stepfather situation wasn't the same for both of our grandmothers.
No.
Yeah, my grandmother had a lovely stepfather who, continued to act as her father for the rest of his life, and she had three half sisters who were born here in Fresno. So she came with one brother, and then she had three more sisters, and they were quite close through their life. So personal learnings and takeaways. Gosh, there's so many.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, I think what I mentioned before just about my grandmother, and the time that I was able to spend with her to talk to her about that, like, even if nothing would have come of that, and it was just getting to spend a day with my grandma, like, I'm so, so thankful for that time that I got to spend with her. Like, I never got to spend a day just the two of us, right? Like, definitely would go over there and spend the night with my brother, or my cousins might be there, or be there for holidays, or with my parents. But to really like spend that time, and so it just makes me think for other folks too, who, whether you're interested in genealogy or not, like, you never can get that time back. And I'm sure you would have loved to have been able to spend some time and ask your grandma those questions, some of those
Sure.
that are coming up now. And so, I just think about the folks that we have in our lives. You don't know how long we have, so I think it's really important to spend that time and ask people questions and learn more about them, regardless of what you're going to do with that information. But I
Yeah.
think it's so important. And I feel like for me, I know you're an educator, but as a teacher, and when I taught middle school and high school English, I think for me, wanting to learn my students' stories, their family stories, was so important. And I think about, my grandma, for whatever reason at that point, felt like she wanted to tell her story to me, and I'm so honored and so grateful for that. And I just think we all have stories that we carry around, and how special it is to be able to be the the one who gets to hear those from folks. And so
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. And as far as writing down stories, you don't have to have a whole story to write something down. I mean, and Google makes it so easy, you know, pick up a Google Doc and just write anything you
Sure.
have. Also, something I started doing a few years ago was when I went to visit my parents, I would record my father. I would say, okay, tell me about elementary school. And he would just talk and talk and talk. So I have those recordings. I'll do something with them someday, but I have those recordings, maybe 4 or 5 different topics that I asked him about. So I'm very thankful to have those. And yeah, speaking to your older relatives is really important, to get bits and pieces of stories. You don't need a whole story, but bits and pieces is good.
sure.
Is good to start
Well,
with.
I think it helps you understand people in a different way.
Yes.
Right?
Understand yourself.
Yeah, no, for sure.
The more you
For
know
sure.
about your history,
For
the more
sure.
you can understand
For
yourself.
sure. But I
Yeah.
also just think like, I think about grandmas and like, I think, in matriarchal family scenarios, like we look up to these women, right? And they're unfallible, but like that is not fair to them. Like they are humans. And I think about all that my grandma went through and that I didn't know about for most of her life, but all the losses that she experienced
Yes.
and the trauma that she would have experienced throughout her life. And so I think it's important for us to be able to see people as like real live human beings and not just like what we've created in our head that's what they are.
And to kind of finish off the story of our 2 grandmothers knowing each other through their lives, as I received items from my grandmother's estate, I found an old address book. Old address book, and your grandmother's name was in there. Of
course.
Yes. And then for my grandmother's funeral, the sign-in, your grandmother attended my grandmother's funeral because I found
Yeah.
her name in there.
And it was so special when you texted that to me, you
Yeah.
sent that to me, and to see my grandmother's handwriting, like I
Yeah.
hadn't seen it really in
okay.
so long. It was
Yeah.
clearly her handwriting. And what I loved too is that I think maybe it was just like the wonky ink pen or whatever, but the over the eye in
Yeah.
Dice there was a heart.
Yeah.
And I just, oh gosh,
Yeah,
it
that was
made me a little emotional
that
to
was
see
great.
that. So yeah,
That was great.
yep.
Okay, well, I just want to encourage you all to get started on collecting your family history. If you've enjoyed the stories that I've been sharing with you, you will feel even better when you share your own stories and learn your own stories, right? Also, in my podcast episode 4, before this one, I gave 9 tips for starting or continuing your research. So if you haven't listened to that one, go back and listen to that one because you'll learn some ways to get started on your research. Yeah.
Yeah. But don't be intimidated, I think.
Right.
Just like if you're interested, you should just kind of jump right in. And it's kind of, so a couple of nights ago, I was talking to my nephew, who is in 6th grade, and they're having to do a family research project.
Oh, fun.
And so my brother realized that he maybe didn't have all the answers. And so he had my nephew give me a call. And so I don't know, I'm like really hopeful as we were going through and I was giving him information about his great grandma, which is my grandmother and grandfather, and on both sides, really. Like I'm hopeful that there'll be someone in my family who will kind of pick this up, right? Because that's the thing. You and I might be into it, but our siblings,
Right.
might not be, or
Children,
other
nieces
folks.
and nephews,
So,
yeah.
So who's going to be the person to like carry that torch?
I think every generation kind of worries about that. I do. I do. Yeah. So, well, thank you, Erin, so much for being here today.
Yeah,
it
thanks
was
for having me.
delightful speaking with you, and I hope we can speak again on some topics that I know you know a lot about. So.
But I haven't always. And I think that's the thing. Like, if something's interesting to you, dig in.
That's
Yeah,
right. That's
yeah.
right. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Germans from Russia experience. I hope that something you heard today will inspire you to learn anything and everything you can about your own ancestors. If you like what you heard, please leave a review, like, and share this podcast. You can comment directly by emailing me at the greexperience@gmail.com. Also, like my Facebook page. the Germans from Russia Experience podcast. Please see my show notes for website suggestions to begin or continue your discovery of your Germans from Russia roots. You can listen from Spotify or my YouTube page, the GREXP Pod. There, you will also find images to enhance the experience of this episode. My podcast artwork is by Matt Wall. My producer is Annie Anderson.